not a Japanese case, but I wanted to do a video on it since I feel like everyone's heard of the same Valentine's Day massacre, but maybe a lot of people don't actually know what happened, myself included, until I started researching it. Even if you know what happened already, though, I read a bunch of articles and included as many different theories as I could find, so maybe there'll still be something new for you too. If you liked the video, please leave a like and a comment, and subscribe if you don't mind. I'm really close to 1,000 subscribers, and I really want to make it there. Also, I'll be doing a tattoo tour for my next video, so keep an eye out if you're interested in that. So, I'm gonna start by setting the scene. Also, I wanted to show my holiday appropriate outfit. It's a heart. So I'm gonna start by setting off the scene. Prohibition, started by the passage of the 18th Amendment in 1920, greatly increased the earnings of America's gangsters through bootlegging and speakeasies, as well as gambling and prostitution all throughout the 1920s. From 1924 to 1930, the city of Chicago gained a widespread reputation for lawlessness and violence. Not coincidentally, that coincided with the reign of Chief Crime Lord Al Scarface Capone, who took over from his boss Johnny Torrio in 1925, who was seriously wounded in an assassination attempt in 1924, and retired to Brooklyn because of that. Capone's income from these activities was estimated at some $60 million a year. His net worth in 1927 was around $100 million. And I don't know if that's like 1920s dollars or if that's adjusted for inflation. Over the years, Al Capone consolidated control over most of Chicago's crime rackets by ruthlessly gunning down his rivals. In 1924, authorities counted some 16 gang-related murders. This brand of slaying continued until 1929, reaching a high of 64 murders in 1 year during that time. Chicago's gang war reached its bloody climax in the so-called St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929. Valentine's Day 1929 began like most other winter mornings in Chicago, with gray skies and stinging cold. A light snow powdered the city sidewalks. Bakers and florists woke up early to prepare for the rush of holiday customers, and all over the city, children put the finishing touches on cards before leaving for school. Of course, not everyone was engaged in wholesome and loving activities. Over at the Cook County Jail, guards prepared for the planned midnight execution of 3 convicted killers. On LaSalle Street, bankers and stockbrokers nervously watched their stock tickers as training began in New York. And inside a garage at 2122 North Clark Street, in the quiet residential neighborhood of Lincoln Park, 7 gangsters stood around waiting. Except for a single white light bulb dangling from the ceiling, the big SMC Cartage Company garage on Clark Street was dark, the parked trucks and cars almost lost in the vast shadowed spaces. A bit of weak winter sun filtered through the grimy front window. The garage was rented by the Irish George Bugs Moran gang, which controlled most of the North Side's illegal alcohol traffic and ran most of its brothels and casinos. Johnny May, dressed in greasy brown coveralls, was lying on his back under a jacked-up truck repairing a wheel. He was a former safe blower hired by Moran as an auto mechanic and one of the countless Chicagoans who could thank Prohibition and the bootlegging business for giving him a good, steady, and relatively safe career. May lived with his wife, his 7 kids, and a dog named Highball, who was tied by his leash to the axle of the truck. The other 6 men were milling around, trying to stay warm. There were the Goosenberg brothers, Frank and Peter, 2 of the city's most troublesome goons and the gang's best enforcers. James Clark, whose real name was Albert Kachalek, Moran's second-in-command and brother-in-law, who was a convicted armed robber and a reputed killer. Adam Hager, aka Frank Snyder, an accountant and embezzler who worked as the gang's bookkeeper and business manager. Albert Weinshank, a nightclub owner and newly appointed officer for the Central Cleaners and Dryers Association, and an optometrist named Reinhard H. Schwimmer, who hung around the Moran boys mostly so he could brag garage was used for storage and repairs, not as a hideout or hangout for the gang. So there was only one explanation why 7 men would be there at an hour when most thugs were still sleeping off the prior night's intoxicants, and it wasn't to exchange Valentines. It's usually assumed that the North Siders were lured to the garage with the promise of a stolen cut-rate shipment of whiskey supplied by Detroit's Purple Gang, which was associated with Capone. The Goosenberg brothers were supposed to drive 2 empty trucks to Detroit that day to pick up 2 loads of stolen Canadian whiskey. At around 10:30 that morning, a big black Cadillac turned from Webster Avenue onto Clark Street, heading south. It stopped in front of the garage, and 4 or 5 men got out of the car. Eyewitness accounts varied on the number of men, though. One man, the driver, wore a fancy chinchilla topcoat and a gray fedora in some accounts. 2 of the men wore police uniforms. The others wore suits, ties, overcoats, and hats. Whatever the number and however they dressed, there were definitely some dressed as police officers, though, and some who were dressed regularly. The wind blew snow dust as they stepped across the sidewalk and into the garage. Most of the Moran gang had arrived at the warehouse by approximately 10:30 a.m., but Moran, their leader, was not there, having left his Parkway Hotel apartment late that morning. He and fellow gang member Ted Newberry were approaching the rear of the garage from a side street when they saw a police car coming up to the building. They immediately turned around, going to a nearby coffee shop. They ran into gang member Harry Goosenberg on the street and warned him, so he also turned back. Northside gang member Willie Marks spotted the police car on his way to the garage and ducked into a doorway to write down the license plate number before leaving the neighborhood. The 2 police officers who were carrying shotguns went into the rear of the garage. If Moran's gangsters were frightened by the new arrivals, they probably didn't show it. Most of the Moran men were armed, but none of them reached for a weapon in time to do anything with it. Maybe they'd been expecting the company, maybe they knew their guests, or maybe seeing men in police uniforms, they decided to play it cool. If it was money the officers wanted, Moran's men had plenty of it. But this wasn't about money. The officers ordered Moran's men to move away from the doors and windows and had them line up shoulder to shoulder against the wall on the garage's northern side, facing the bricks. Once they were lined up, the cops signaled to the men in regular clothes who'd come in with them. 2 of the killers opened fire with Thompson submachine guns, one with a 20-round box magazine and the other a 50-round drum. They were thorough, spraying their victims left and right, even continuing to fire after all 7 men had hit the floor. In the end, they fired about 70 bullets total. 2 shotgun blasts afterward all but obliterated the faces of John May and James Clark, according to the coroner's report. Blood dark as motor oil surged across the cold concrete floor and slid thickly down a drain. Some men died instantly, some gasped briefly for air. Out on Clark Street, neighbors heard popping noises, which some mistook for the sound of a car engine backfiring. Others heard the desperate howling of a dog. A few peered out their windows in time to see the men in police uniforms leading the other men at gunpoint out of the garage after the shooting, possibly pretending like they were arresting them. The Cadillac sped down South Clark Street, zigzagging to avoid a trolley, and disappeared from view somewhere around Armitage Avenue. Soon one of the neighbors walked over to the garage and pushed open the door. He spotted mutilated bodies on the floor and inhaled the stench of blood. Smoke still hung in the air. Highball continued howling. 6 men were dead, but Frank Goosenberg was still alive. Sergeant Thomas J. Loftus, a veteran of the 36th District Station, responded first to the call. After moving a bunch of neighbors away from the bodies, he spotted Frank Goosenberg, shot 14 times but still hanging on. "Do you know me, Frank?" the sergeant asked. "Yes, you're Tom Loftus," the gangster said between gulps of air. Then Goosenberg added, "I won't talk," as if he knew from experience what the next question was going to be. But after a moment, Goosenberg, according to some newspaper articles anyway, did talk briefly, saying, "Cops did it." Then he added, "For God's sake, get me to a hospital." Most of the other articles I read said that the cops asked him who shot him, and he said, no one shot me." So I'm not sure which is right, because it does come back up later that he said cops shot him, so yeah. He got to the hospital and died there 3 hours later without further comment. Even though Prohibition had made millionaire celebrities out of gangsters like Al Capone and turned the nation's justice system into a cesspit of corruption, people tolerated the situation because they counted on the bootleggers to get them their booze, and because almost all of the related violence was of the gangster-on-gangster variety. But the slaughter of 7 men, with gruesome photos adorning the front pages of newspapers nationwide, proved too much to stomach for many. George Bugs Moran was a career criminal who ran the North Side Gang in Chicago during the 1920s. He fought bitterly with Al Capone for control of smuggling and trafficking operations in the Windy City. Throughout the 1920s, both survived several attempted murders. One notorious occasion, Moran and his associates drove 6 cars past a hotel in Cicero, Illinois, where Capone and his associates were having lunch, and showered the building with more than 1,000 bullets. Moran had also been muscling in on Capone Run dog tracks in the Chicago suburbs, and he'd taken over several saloons that were run by Capone, insisting that they were in his territory. Earlier in the year, Frank Gusenberg and his brother Peter unsuccessfully attempted to murder Jack McGurn, a member of Capone's gang. The North Side Gang was complicit in the murders of Pasqualino, Patsy Lolordo, and Antonio the Scourge Lombardo. Both had been presidents of the Unione Siciliana, the local mafia, and close associates of Capone. A $50,000 bounty on Capone's head was the final straw for him, and $15,000 in 1926 is equivalent to about $838,409 today, so it's a pretty big bounty. He ordered that Moran's North Side Gang be destroyed. Of course, after all that, Moran was still alive, so their plan ultimately failed. The lookouts probably mistook Albert Weinshank for Moran, since they were the same height and build, and that physical similarity between the two was enhanced by the fact that they had both dressed pretty much the same that morning, coincidentally in the same color overcoats and hats. At the time of the massacre, Al Capone sat in a Dade County, Florida courthouse wearing one of his fashionable summer ensembles, white flannel trousers, a checkered sport jacket, and a light gray fedora. He was 30 years old, overweight but still powerfully built, and had a sharply receding hairline. Though world famous now as a villain, he was almost never photographed without a smile. Capone was there for an interview with Louis Goldstein, a prosecutor from Brooklyn who was investigating the murder of Capone's old friend and mentor, Frankie Yale, in New York. Capone was so confident that he came without a lawyer, but he may have regretted his decision when the questions began to bore in on his personal finances and not the murder of Yale. What has money got to do with it? He asked at one point. He'd known for months that the feds were looking at his taxes, but he may have been lulled into a false sense of security because no one from the Bureau of Internal Revenue had come to the meeting. By the time the interview was over, news of the massacre in Chicago had spread by phone and telegraph across the country. The black and white photos that came with were among the most graphically violent ever to appear in American press. Chicago may have already been known as the nation's gangland murder capital, but this crime was shocking even by those standards. Capone would brag in the days after that he had an airtight alibi, which he really did, but it doesn't really matter since it's not like he had to be at the scene to be responsible for it. The massacre raised the nation's simmering resentment over gangland violence to a boil, and from coast to coast, people suddenly had come to the conclusion that a line had been crossed. The violence had become too much, and the experiment known as Prohibition had blown up once and for all. In Chicago, the mild-mannered U.S. Attorney George E.Q. Johnson, the man in charge of the federal effort to put Capone behind bars, called the massacre, quote, the most amazing crime in Chicago's amazing criminal history. Detectives, federal law enforcement officers, named 50 motives for this crime, complained David Stansbury, the lead investigator for the state's attorney's office, but no one stands out as being important enough to be called the probable cause of the murders. The only thing Stansbury seemed fairly sure of was that Al Capone had not been involved. Less than 1 month after the crime, Herbert Hoover took the oath of office as the nation's 31st president, and he was determined to put an end to the Wild West style of lawlessness. The most malign of all these dangers today is disregard and disobedience of the law, he said. Crime is increasing. Confidence in rigid and speedy justice is decreasing. Herbert Hoover almost certainly knew that Capone wasn't involved too, as did the men in Chicago assigned by the president to get Capone, and their refusal to acknowledge his innocence was one of the many reasons that the crime would eventually go unsolved. But that wasn't what the feds wanted to hear, that Capone wasn't involved. There's a strong possibility that the killing even had nothing to do with Bugs Moran himself. The explanation for the massacre may have been much simpler than anyone imagined. Nothing Prohibition or gang war related, just pure and simple revenge. Maybe the assassins were gunning for the Gusenberg brothers, who had an uncanny knack for getting in trouble. Specifically, some people thought that the Gusenberg brothers may have been the targets because they'd killed a young firefighter, and his family wanted payback. Or maybe it really was just business related. Almost every day in Chicago, someone was hijacking a bootlegger's truckload of booze or muscling a speakeasy owner to get him to switch suppliers. These types of things routinely ended in violence. Some investigators initially pursued the simplest and most obvious explanation, that Frank Gusenberg had been right and it really was cops who did it. After all, the men looked like cops and their vehicle looked like a police car. The investigators quickly tossed out that theory, though, saying that Gusenberg must have been mistaken and that the men in uniform must have been imposters. They never explained why, though. Their next theory was that the murder had been the work of the Purple Gang, an outfit from Detroit, acting in retaliation for the recent hijacking of a truckload of whiskey. Landladies Mrs. Duty and Mrs. Orvidson had taken in 3 men as roomers 10 days before the massacre, and their rooming houses were directly across from the North Clark Street garage. The landladies picked out mugshots of Purple Gang members George Lewis, Eddie Fletcher, Phil Keywell, and his younger brother Harry, but they later wavered in their identification. The police questioned and cleared Fletcher, Lewis, and Harry Keywell. Then came the idea that the massacre might have been connected to a vicious aldermanic election in the 20th Ward, where Capone supported one candidate and Moran another. Investigators also considered the possibility that the massacre was tied to the fight for control of the city's dry cleaning rackets. Albert Weinshank was a central figure in the laundry business after all. Police even considered Moran himself as a suspect at one point. The gang boss was seen driving past the garage at about the time of the murder. Why didn't he go in? Was it possible that he had gotten tired of the Gusenberg's insubordination and decided to put an end to it? But why would Moran eliminate the other innocent members of his gang, including a lowly mechanic, if that was the case? After 5 days of hopping from one theory to another, police officers reverted to their original notion, saying they had new evidence suggesting that the killing had in fact been the work of police officers. Moran's gang had stolen a truckload of liquor from a crooked cop, according to a story in the Chicago Evening Post, and the unnamed cop had retaliated. The Evening Post quoted a witness who said that the car seen in front of the garage was, quote, a police squad automobile beyond any doubt. It even had a gun rack fastened on the rear of the front seat. Another witness had told police, just about the time I arrived in front of the place, an automobile I thought was a police squad car stopped in front of the garage. There were 5 men in it. The fellow who stayed at the wheel had a finger missing. His hand was spread out on the steering apparatus, so the odd amputation was apparent. None of the various theories completely explained what had gone down, and each one had its plot holes. Why had the men gathered in the garage that morning? Why were they so well dressed? And why wasn't Bugs Moran with them? If it had really been cops who wanted to kill Moran's men, why didn't they do it the usual way, by arresting them, shooting them, then claiming afterward that it was because they tried to escape? Also, 2 of the dead men, the mechanic John E. May and the optometrist Reinhard H. Schwimmer, were innocent victims, since neither were really members of the gang. For them to get killed, the perpetrators must have been acting in anger, Police were called to the scene of a garage fire on Wood Street where they found a 1927 Cadillac sedan, disassembled and partially burned, and determined that it was the killer's car. They traced the engine number to a Michigan Avenue dealer who'd sold the car to a guy named James Morton from Los Angeles. The garage had been rented by a man calling himself Frank Rogers, who gave his address as 1859 West North Avenue. That was the address of the Circus Cafe, run by Claude Maddox, a former St. Louis gangster with ties to the Capone gang, the Purple Gang, and the St. Louis gang Egan's Rats. Police couldn't turn up any information about James Morton or Frank Rogers, but they had a definite lead on one of the killers. Just minutes before the massacre, a truck driver named Elmer Lewis had turned a corner a block away from 2122 North Clark and sideswiped a police car. He told police that he stopped immediately but was waved away by the uniformed driver, who was missing a front tooth. Board of Education President H. Wallace Caldwell had witnessed the accident, and he gave the same description of the driver. The police were confident that they were describing Fred Burke, a former member of Egan's Rats. Burke and a close friend named James Ray were known to wear police uniforms whenever they went on a robbery spree. Burke was also a fugitive under indictment for robbery and murder in Ohio. In addition, police suggested that Joseph Lolordo could have been one of the killers because of his brother Pascalino's recent murder by the Northside Gang. Police announced that they suspected Capone gunmen John Scalise, Albert Anselmi, Frank Rio, a Capone bodyguard, and machine gun Jack McGurn, Capone's top executioner, on the hunch that he was always a suspect when multiple shots were fired. But when they finally found him, Machine Gun Jack didn't seem worried. Me, mixed up in that gang killing? Don't make me laugh. The Goosenberg boys would have plugged me if they saw me a block away. When an Evening Post reporter asked him for his theory on who had killed Moran's men, McGurn didn't hesitate, saying flatly, "It was coppers." Police eventually charged McGurn and Scalise with the massacre. In the days after the massacre, Scalise was heard bragging, quote, "I am the most powerful man in Chicago." Unione Siciliana President Joseph Hoptoad Quinta had recently elevated him to the position of Unione's vice president. But then Scalise, Anselmi, and Quinta were found dead on a lonely road near Hammond, Indiana on May 8, 1929. Word on the street had it that Capone had discovered that the pair were planning to betray him, so Capone produced a baseball bat at a dinner party thrown in their honor and beat the trio to death. The police dropped the murder charges against Jack McGurn because of a lack of evidence, and he was just charged with a violation of the Mann Act, which originally made it a felony to engage in interstate or foreign commerce transport of any woman or girl for the purpose of prostitution or debauchery, or for any other immoral purpose. And he violated that law, or that act, when he took his girlfriend Louise Rolfe across state lines to get married. On the 7th anniversary of the massacre, Jack McGurn was killed in a crowded bowling alley with a burst of machine gun fire. McGurn's killer remains unidentified, but was very likely Moran, though he was never charged with the murder. Though the St. Valentine's Day massacre marked the end of any significant gang opposition to Capone's rule in Chicago, it can also be said to have marked the beginning of his downfall. With his highly effective organization, his impressive income, and his willingness to ruthlessly eliminate his rivals, Capone had become the country's most notorious gangster, and the newspapers dubbed him Public Enemy No. 1. On March 20th, 1929, President Hoover met at the White House with a group of prominent Chicagoans. Quote, "They gave me chapter and verse for their statement that Chicago was known bank robber and hired gun, and the guy police suspected earlier for his habit of dressing up like a cop when he robbed places, smashed his car into another car near the police station in St. Joseph, Michigan, 100 miles from Chicago. Burke had been drinking that night, then rear-ended the other vehicle and drove off. Patrolman Charles Skelly chased after him and ended up forcing him off the road. Skelly hopped onto the running board of Burke's car, but then he was shot 3 times and killed. Burke's car was found wrecked and abandoned just outside St. Joseph, and police traced it to a man named Fred Dane. Police searched for Burke at his home near the town of Stevensville and didn't find him. Then the Berrien County, Michigan Sheriff's Department raided the St. Joseph, Michigan bungalow of Frederick Dane. By this time, police photos confirmed that Dane was in fact Fred Burke, wanted by Chicago police for participation in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. In the bungalow, police found a large trunk that had a bulletproof vest, almost $320,000 worth of bonds that had recently been stolen from a bank in Wisconsin, 2 Thompson submachine guns, serial numbers 2347 and 7580, 7 revolvers, 11 tear gas canisters, 2 shotguns, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. St. Joseph police immediately told the Chicago police, who requested both machine guns. They used the new science of forensic ballistics to identify both weapons as having been used in the massacre. They also discovered that one of them had been used to murder New York mobster Frankie Yale a year and a half earlier, which confirmed the New York Police Department's long-held theory that Burke had been responsible for Yale's death. Unfortunately, no further concrete evidence surfaced in the massacre case. Les Farmer, a deputy sheriff in Marion, Illinois, had bought gun number 2347 on November 12, 1924, 5 years before the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Marion and the surrounding area were overrun by the warring bootleg factions of the Shelton Brothers gang and Charlie Berger. Deputy Sheriff Farmer had ties with the Egan's Rats, based 100 miles away in St. Louis, and the Tommy gun ended up in Fred Burke's hands by 1927. It's possible that he used the same gun in Detroit's Millflores murder. You'd think ballistic evidence would be a done deal, but Burke was never charged with either the massacre or the murder of New York mobster Frankie Yale. If Chicago authorities ever asked him whether the Tommy guns had been in his possession on February 14th, 1929, or if he'd been working for Capone at the time, his answers were never made public. After Burke's little hit and run, he eluded the cops for more than a year, until on March 26, 1931, he was captured on a Missouri farm and arrested. The case against him was strongest in connection to the murder of Officer Skelly, so he was tried in Michigan for it and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison in 1940. Back in February 1931, all that with Burke and his Tommy guns was happening, and in the meantime, a federal court found Capone guilty on the contempt charge and sentenced him to 6 months in Cook County Jail, and the U.S. Treasury Department started an investigation of Capone for income tax evasion. Through diligent forensic accounting, Special Agent Frank Wilson and other members of the intelligence unit of the Internal Revenue Service put together a case, and in June 1931, Capone was indicted for evasion of federal income tax. Convicted that October after an internationally publicized trial, Capone was sentenced to 11 years in prison, which was a very harsh sentence for the crime. At that time, to be served first in Atlanta and later at Alcatraz. A blow to the belt, Capone called it, but what can you expect when the whole community is prejudiced against you? On January 8, 1935, FBI agents surrounded a Chicago apartment building at 3920 North Pine Grove, looking for the remaining members of the Barker gang. A brief shootout erupted, resulting in the death of bank robber Russell Gibson. Taken into custody were Doc Barker, Byron Bolton, and 2 women. Bolton was a Navy machine gunner and an associate of Egan's Rats, and he had been the valet of Chicago hitman Frank Coates. Bolton was privy to many of the Barker gang's crimes and pinpointed the Florida hideout of Ma and Freddie Barker, who were both killed in a shootout with the FBI a week later. Bolton said he took part in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre with Coates, Fred Burke, and several others. The FBI had no jurisdiction in the state murder case, so they kept Bolton's revelations confidential until the Chicago American newspaper reported a second-hand version of his confession. The newspaper declared that the crime had been solved, despite being stonewalled by J. Campagna, Daniel Zaratella, William Pacelli, and Bolton. The men stayed there for 2 or 3 weeks, hunting and fishing when they weren't planning the murder of their enemies. Bolton said that he and Jimmy Moran were charged with watching the SMC Cartage garage and phoning the signal in to the killers at the Circus Cafe when Bugs Moran arrived at the meeting. Police had found a letter addressed to Bolton in the lookout nest, and possibly a vial of prescription medicine as well. Bolton guessed that the actual killers had been Burke, Winkler, Coates, Bob Carey, Raymond, Crane Neck Nugent, and Claude Maddox, 4 shooters and 2 getaway drivers. Bolton's version was different than the one most historians generally had in mind. He said that he only saw plainclothes men exit the Cadillac and go into the garage, meaning that a second car was used by the killers. George Bridget said that he saw at least 2 uniformed men exiting a car in the alley and entering the garage through its rear doors. A Peerless Motor Company sedan had been found near a Maywood house owned by Claude Maddox in the days after the massacre, and inside was an address book belonging to Albert Weinshank, one of the gang members who'd been killed. Bolton said that he had mistaken one of Moran's men to be Moran himself and called it into the Circus Cafe. The killers had expected to kill Moran and 2 or 3 of his men, but they were unexpectedly confronted with 7 instead. So they decided to just kill them all and get out fast. Bolton said that Capone was furious with him for his mistake and the resulting police pressure and threatened to kill him, only to be talked down by Fred Coates. His claims were corroborated by Gus Winkler's widow Georgette in an official FBI statement and in her memoirs, which were published in a 4-part series in a True Detective magazine during the winter of 1935 to 1936. She revealed that her husband and his friends had formed a special crew used by Capone for high-risk jobs. The mob boss was said to have trusted them implicitly and named them the American Boys. Bolton's statements were also backed up by William Drury, a Chicago detective who had stayed on the massacre case long after everyone else had given up. Bank robber Alvin Carbis later said he heard a second-hand account about the massacre and that the American Boys were paid a collective salary of $2,000 a week, which would be about $34,713 in today's currency, plus bonuses. Carbis also said that Capone had told him while they were in Alcatraz together that Coates had been the actual planner of the massacre. Despite Byron Bolton's statements, the FBI didn't do anything about it. All the men he named were dead by 1935, other than Burke and Maddox. Bank robber Harvey Bailey complained in his 1973 autobiography that he and Fred Burke had been drinking beer in Calumet City, Illinois at the time of the massacre, and the resulting heat forced them to abandon their bank robbing ventures. Historians are still divided on whether or not the American Boys committed the St. Valentine's Day massacre. Even though nothing official came of Bolton's confession, his highly publicized story caught the eye of a Chicagoan named Frank T. Farrell. When Farrell read Bolton's version of events, he sat down and wrote a letter to J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, dated January 28, 1935, saying he had information that might be useful to the feds. His account, recently discovered in the FBI archives and never before revealed, offers the most logical and satisfying solution to the crime ever presented. In cramped but tidy script, Farrell told the director that he had been doing undercover investigation work. He gives no more detail than that, and neither do the FBI archives. At the time of the massacre, he said that if federal agents would check Chicago police logs, they would find that a 40-year-old former firefighter named William Davin Jr., the son of a Chicago police sergeant, had been shot during a bar fight in November 1928. Davin had been in the kitchen of the C&O restaurant at 509 North Clark Street, a popular gangster hangout, when a fight erupted and he was shot in the stomach. Spurting blood, he was carried to a car, driven to the corner of Rush Street and Austin Avenue, and dumped there. Davin managed to crawl to a fire station call box to call for help. He was taken to the hospital, where he held on for a month. And while he wouldn't tell police who had shot him, Davin did tell his first cousin, William White. William Davin and William White had grown up together in Chicago, and as he lay dying, Davin decided that there was only one man he could trust, and he gave White the names of several members of the Moran gang, including one of the Gusenberg brothers. In his letter guys who shot me," Davern told his cousin. William Three-Finger Jack White was beady-eyed, bald, double-chinned, and even tougher than he was ugly. A boyhood accident or a botched safe-cracking job, accounts varied, had taken 2 of the fingers on his right hand. For the better part of the decade, he had maintained status as one of Chicago's most vicious criminals. When Davern died, White made up his mind to avenge his cousin's murder and contacted the same Goosenberg brother who had been involved, saying he was planning to hold up the factory for its payroll and needed men to help. White probably knew both the Goosenbergs already. They had allegedly worked together in 1926 on the $80,000 robbery, which would be about $1,388,503 today, of the International Harvester Factory on 31st Street. In that job, they had used 8 men, and when one of those men ratted to the cops and started naming his accomplices, White arranged for 2 of his cohorts to disguise themselves as police, go to the rat's house, and murder him while he slept. White knew that when people saw police uniforms, they tended to be more trusting, and they tended to not notice the distinguishing features of the men in the uniforms. All they saw were hats and badges, and getting uniforms was easy since White knew plenty of crooked cops. In this case, he might have gotten help from his uncle, Sergeant William J. Davern of the Chicago Police Department, who also was the father of the man killed at the C&O restaurant. Farrell's letter resolves many of the mysteries surrounding the massacre. It helps explain why so many of Moran's men were in the garage that morning, why they were dressed well, and why they never fired their guns when faced by their intruders. It also offers a clear motive, one with enough emotional power to explain the fury of the attack. It may even account for why the investigation of the crime went nowhere. Maybe word had spread through the police department that the gang killing had been carried out in retaliation for the murder of a cop's kid. Sergeant Davern might have provided the uniforms in the police car. That could have been enough to stop further investigation and persuade the detectives to accept what had happened as a form of justice. If White had been arrested and confessed that he'd committed the crime in retaliation for the murder of Davern, the newspapermen would have followed up with the next logical questions. Was Sergeant Davern involved? Did other cops help him commit or cover up the crime? And once those questions were asked, the reporters no doubt would have cited the dying words of Frank Goosenberg, which to this day remain the only testimony from a victim of the crime. Cops did it. According to FBI documents released under the Freedom of Information Act for several years in the early 1930s, White worked as a federal informant, supplying information about Chicago hoodlums to federal agents in exchange for protection. If J. Edgar Hoover knew about White's role in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, the Bureau might have helped to cover his tracks for fear of losing an informant and jeopardizing the lives of the agents who worked with him. In January 1934, when some of his peers figured out that White was a rat working for the FBI, White was executed at his house. Federal agents were seen visiting White at home shortly before the murder, but the killers were never caught. A year later, when Hoover got the letter from Frank T. Farrell suggesting that White had been responsible for the nation's greatest unsolved crime, the director replied that the gangland killing was a matter for local police and of no interest to the Bureau. In other words, as far as he was concerned, the case was closed. Farrell was never again heard from, and recent attempts to locate his family were unsuccessful. Meanwhile, Al Capone was released from Alcatraz in 1939, a completely different man than when he'd gone in. His mind was wrecked by syphilis, and his criminal power was gone. Over the course of his prison time, he was interviewed by psychiatrists and prison officials, and he talked about his regrets. He said he wished that he had not been so friendly toward the press because the publicity he earned had put a target on his back. He said he felt that his lawyers had failed him and that the judge assigned to his case had been unfair. He apologized for the grief he had caused his mother, his wife, and his son. But he never mentioned the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, the crime that helped both cement his legend and end his career. He died a recluse in his Florida home in 1947 at the age of 48. The cause of death was heart failure, but he'd had end-stage syphilis that definitely contributed. In 1995, Chicago criminologist Arthur Bielek, who had researched the massacre through FBI files and court transcripts for 30 years, named the participants in the massacre to have been Capone henchman Machine Gun Jack McGurn, who assembled the murder team that included lookouts Byron Bolton, Jimmy Moran, who was not related to Bugs Moran at all, and Jimmy McCreason. watch the garage and alert Tony Accardo and the other triggermen, Fred Burke, Gus Winkler, Freddie Coates, and Robert Carey, when Bugs Moran showed up to the garage. Another team member, according to Bielek, was Claude Screwy Maddox, who got the killer's transportation, a car that looked like those used by police. With the stage set, Capone and McGurn established alibis, Capone going to Florida, McGurn checked into a local hotel with his wife, Louise Rolfe. His claims were backed up by the former FBI agent William Romer, who had heard claims of Tony Accardo also being involved as one of the shooters on several occasions by Murray the Camel Humphreys through a microphone planted in a Chicago tailor shop in 1959. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre actually proved to be the last confrontation for both Capone and Moran. Capone was put in jail in 1931, like I said before, and Moran lost so many important men that he couldn't control his territory anymore. Moran was relegated to small-time robberies until he was sent to jail in 1946. He died in Leavenworth Federal Prison in 1957 from lung cancer. Officially, this case is considered unsolved, and it'll probably stay that way since obviously everyone involved is, by this point, long dead. The garage at 2122 North Clark Street was demolished in 1967, and the site is now a parking lot for a nursing home. The bricks of the north wall that the gangsters were shot in front of were purchased by a Canadian businessman, and for years they were displayed in various crime-related novelty displays. Many of them were later sold individually, and the remainder are now owned by the Mob Museum in Las Vegas. Obviously, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre has had a huge impact on popular culture, maybe almost as much as Al Capone himself has been portrayed in, featured in, or mentioned in too many movies to name, both true and fictionalized. Since it's such a popular case, and there was a lot of information, I hope my retelling of it wasn't too confusing. I tried to keep it chronological, and I didn't want to get too carried away with talking about Al Capone, since this video is really about the massacre itself and not about him specifically. But I also didn't want to leave out what became of him either, though I mean a lot of people probably already know that, so. And I'm sorry if there were any inaccuracies, since obviously it's hard to tell the difference between what's factual and what was just urban legend or speculation that